This is Research Like a Pro, episode 48, United States Land Records, part 1. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the creators of the Amazon best-selling book, Research Like a Pro, a Genealogist's Guide. I'm Nicole, co-host of the podcast. Join Diana and me as we discuss how to stay organized, make progress in our research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the show. I'm Nicole Dyer, co-host of the Research Like a Pro genealogy podcast. I'm here with accredited genealogist Diana Elder. Hi, Diana. How's it going?
I'm doing well, better today than I was last week when I had a cold, so hopefully my voice is back to normal. I've had some fun doing research this week. I've been working on a project with Cherokee records, and I've had to learn about a whole new record set, which is part of the fun of doing genealogy, isn't it, Nicole, when we have to learn something new and exciting?
I love it.
This week I learned about the Guyon Miller roll and did a bunch of research in that for the client's ancestors looking for connections. And, it was really fascinating to read all the different applications and stories and people's claims, to be connected somehow to the Cherokee tribe so that they could possibly get some of the money that was involved. So it's been kind of a fun week doing that research.
That's great. I think I mentioned that I've been working on a project in Austria-Hungary, and so part of that I've had to learn a lot of Latin, and Google Translate has been really helpful, and so has various resources like the FamilySearch Wiki, but a lot of the church records that I'm looking at are in Latin, so that's been neat.
Wow, Latin is fun. I had to learn some of that when I was doing some Irish research. Same thing with Catholic church records.
Yep, it's fun. I mean, you're right. That's why we love genealogy, because we're always learning something new.
Yep.
All right, our review today, our listener spotlight, is Lucky Liz. She said, I have been researching my family for close to 20 years and have made some wonderful discoveries. But looking back, I realized the things I did not do, among other things. Keep a comprehensive research log and write up my discoveries in a report. I thought I would never forget what I discovered and how I uncovered that information. Finding Nicole and Diana's website, Family Locket, has certainly been an eye-opener for me. The articles they post open a better way of doing genealogy research. I love listening to their podcasts and have heard several episodes more than once. I have subscribed to the e-course and am slowly becoming better at the thing I love, family history. Thank you, Liz. It's fun to hear from you guys, and we love doing our listener spotlights and reading these reviews, so keep them coming. Thank you.
Yes, I love that. It's so fun to hear that we're helping other people. Because as teachers, that's what we both love to do, is to teach and help others learn how to be better at anything. So today we are talking about land records. So we're going to help everybody who's listening to learn how to search land records. This may be a record type that you've been a little afraid of because it sounds scary, it's unfamiliar. These are not generally indexed, and they're written in the old handwriting. And really, is it something you need to do? That's kind of the question that we all wonder.
So why should we search land records? What value can the genealogist find in them?
Well, land records actually can state family relationships that are nowhere else. I've had several people contact me and have me look up land records at the Family History Library for them because they weren't digitized yet. And the reason they needed them was because it had a suspected family relationship that they needed for a DAR application or to prove a line in their family. And the land record stated specifically that the gentleman was deeding this land to his daughter and named her for, 1 shilling or $1, which you'll often find when it's family, because they're just doing a token amount that's basically a gift. And that can be the only place where it's stated that someone is a daughter or a son-in-law, especially if you are working in the early 1800s or the 1700s. It can be super beneficial for your research.
That is good.
It also puts your ancestor in a certain place and time. We have those census years where we know where they are in 1810 and 1820, but when did they actually get to their new location if there's two different locations? And if we find a land record, then we know, oh, well, he was buying land in 1815, so he was already here by then. It helps us to fill in our timeline, and it helps us to put more things in perspective. Each record that we discover helps with that timeline analysis and puts more pieces of the puzzle together. Now, another thing that you may not have thought of, that the land description will reveal adjoining landowners. And who are the people that own the land around your ancestor? These are the neighbors. These are the associates. And these could be major clues in tracking your ancestor back to a previous state or a different county. It could be a huge clue in differentiating them from men of the same name. Knowing where they lived, it'll let you plot that. And oftentimes, in some of the really old records, like I was just doing a case in Maryland, and they actually say who the landowner was. They'll say it goes to this line and adjoins the land of, and gives the name of the landowner. If you're working in later land records, you might have to actually plot them out and look for the people on the land plots around them. So there's always a way you can figure it out. Now, another reason that land records are great is because it applies to so many people. And the reason is people were very concerned with keeping track of their deeds. So if the courthouse burned, they would often take their deed back in and have it re-recorded because their right to the land was very, very important to them. Sometimes that might be the only record that has survived because it's been re-recorded. Also, our land records can exist from the very first time land was given out. So early in the 1600s, it might be the only record that you have for a really early ancestor. Now, it's really helpful that generally there are indexes for these. We have the grantor and the grantee indexes. So if your person either sold land or bought land, they'll be in an index. And when we look through those indexes, that also can be like a census, a pre-1850 census for a county. You're going to see all the different people who are living in that county. You can see if there were different people of the same name, possible family members, and it can be very helpful in getting a really good scope of who was there at a certain time. And also, land records often were the very first records they started keeping. As people came into the area, they would go get those land records, get their deeds recorded, or get their land patents, and it can be a very early record for your ancestor.
Yeah, it's amazing how many of those old deeds have survived. I recently looked at some this last month that were from the 1600s, and the handwriting was pretty different back then. A lot of those backwards E's that are actually O's. Very interesting trying to read that old handwriting in the deeds from the 1600s.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about different kinds of land records. This might be kind of intimidating too because there are a lot of different land records. So Nicole, what are some of the different ones that we might run into?
All right, so we're going to talk about two categories of land records. The first category is the transfer of either state or federal government land to the individual. These kind of land records are usually called bounty land, head rights, patents, warrants, and grants. So that would be the transfer of land to the individual from the government, whether state or federal government. Then the other category is the transfer of land from individual to individual. And these are usually called deeds or conveyances. And these deeds are kept on the county level, and they're generally available at the county courthouse. And luckily, FamilySearch has digitized the deeds for many of the United States counties, and these can often be viewed from home now. You can find them by looking in the FamilySearch catalog and going to the county that your relative lived in. So those are our two categories that we kind of split it into: the transfer from the government to an individual, and then the transfer from an individual to an individual. So today we're not talking about the transfer from the government to the individual. We're just going to talk about some other things. So let's go on and talk about the different kinds of land states that there are, because there's state land states and then there's federal land states. Do you want to tackle that, Diana?
Sure. So you may have been hearing these terms, state land state or federal land state, or you maybe have never heard that term, in which case we're going to teach you all about that today. So it all has to do with how the land in an area was originally allocated. Did the state government allocate the land or the federal government? So think back to when you were in U.S. history in high school or college or junior high, whenever, and you learned about the original 13 colonies. Well, land in the 1600s and 1700s was dispensed by whatever foreign power had possession of the colony. So if you're going along the eastern seaboard of the United States, that was England. If you were in Texas, that would be Spain. Could be French for the time that they had land in Louisiana. It's depending on who was colonizing that land. And the land was dispensed by that foreign power. Generally, by the time of the Revolutionary War, the entire eastern seaboard was primarily settled, and the states retained control of the land, and so those are your state land states. But after the war, when people started moving west, then we had some different things come into play. We had Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia that were basically extensions of state land states, North Carolina and Virginia. And so they were retained. They are still state land states. And when Texas joined the United States, it already had a land system based on the Spanish colonial years. And so it was also a state land state. Then when Hawaii came into the United States, the land there had been distributed by the chiefs of the islands. So those were just kind of the unique states that aren't along the eastern seaboard. And so you can think of that you've got, all up and down the eastern coast, then you've got Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia, then Texas and Hawaii, and those are your state land states. In all, there's 20 of the 50 known as state land states. And then all the rest of the states, which would be 30, are federal land states. And these are the ones where the federal government distributed the land. These are the ones that use the federal grid system. And we're going to talk a lot more about that. So let's start off with the state land states. And Nicole, I think you're going to talk to us about how those lands were measured.
Okay, great. So it's important to know what kind of land you're dealing with, federal land state or state land state, because they use different ways of measuring the land. So when you look at a land record, you will see different terms used, and you can use those terms to plot the land. So let's talk about state land states. These are the states that we just mentioned were all along the eastern seaboard, those original colonies, and Virginia, Tennessee, those kind of states. So in those states, the way that the land was measured was typically with metes and bounds. It was generally surveyed with that system. So what you might encounter in a land record with metes and bounds is a lot of reference points, like the large oak tree or 90 degrees south of the bend in the creek. So they're using reference points that they could spot with their eyes, that were landmarks, that were trees, and that kind of thing. So if you're working with a land record in a state land state and you want to map out the land and plot it out, you can do that. And we will have a link in the show notes for more explanation from an article by Kimberly Powell that we recommend called Metes, Bounds, and Meanders. So here's an example from a Tennessee land grant. This is from 1797. 50 acres, part of said warrant, lying in Hickman County in the 1st District on both sides of Mill Creek of Pine River between John Cooper's and Jesse Cooper's, beginning at a small hickory near John Cooper's house on the east boundary line of David Robertson, entry made on location 435, 99 poles south of said Robertson's northeast corner, running east 89 poles across Mill Creek. Phew! Did I say that right, Mom?
I guess. It's like reading a foreign language, isn't it? Metes and bounds.
Right. The first time I transcribed the land record with all of these funny things in it, like different kinds of oaks, like a Spanish oak and a white oak, I couldn't figure out what that was. And the handwriting was really sloppy. And I was like, why are they talking about oaks?
I think they're pretty entertaining to read. And I love the bends in the creek, or sometimes you'll get a big, large rock. And I'm thinking, man, it'd be really fun to go back and try to figure out where the land
Right.
is based on that.
And what if somebody moves that rock or chops down that tree?
Yeah, and since it's been a couple hundred years since some of these were actually written, that very well could be a problem.
Right. Oh my goodness. Well, you may be wondering, what is that unit of measurement that was referenced in the land description as a pole? A pole equals 16 and a half feet. And you may run across a lot of other terms of measurement when you're looking at meets and bounds land descriptions like chains, links, furlong, rod, league, labor, and arpent. So you don't need to memorize all these terms, but if you come across them, you can just do a quick Google search and then see how to convert them into feet or whatever makes more sense to you. And we do have a reference book that we recommend for learning about land, and that is by E. Wade Hone. And the book is titled Land and Property Research in the United States. So we will put a link to that in the show notes as well so that you can do some more reading if you want to really dive into this.
Yes, and that book is so helpful. When I was working on accreditation, I needed to learn about all the land, and I had the Gulf South states, and so I had a variety of land. I had the Texan land, which was totally different, and then I had a lot of federal land states to work with, like Arkansas and Alabama. So anyway, I used Mr. Holmes' book and read and really studied how to use land, and I still go back to it and look up little things for reference. Sometimes it's just really nice to have a good reference book, even though we can learn a lot on the internet. FamilySearch Wiki has some good articles on land, and other people have done blog posts also, but I really like having a good book. Now, you might be thinking, wow, those state land states measurements are really wacky, a league, a labor, a furlong. So rest assured that once you come to your federal land states, they have a nice grid system that can also seem kind of like a foreign language until you get the hang of it. So you might have seen this in a land patent or a deed of your ancestor, and you get something like the northeast half of the northeast quarter of section 13. Well, the really cool thing is, because it is a grid system, once you understand that, you can draw out your ancestors' land. If you go to the blog post that we'll link to where I wrote about this, you'll get to see a picture. It's kind of hard to describe it, but I'm going to do my best. So just imagine that you've got a big square, and this is the township. Now, you've got two different terms for townships in genealogy. One is like a village or a town, right? That's, just a little gathering of people. But federal land measurements also use the term township, and these are something totally different. In this case, a township is a big section of 36 square miles. So now just picture in your head a big square, 36 square miles, so that means it's 6 miles across and it's 6 miles deep. So you've got 6 miles by 6 miles, and that's called a township. And the townships are given a description that's going to be north or south of the baseline and east and west of the principal meridian. Okay, so we have two more terms. Principal meridians are just designated across the United States, as are the baselines. And so when you get something like, one of those terms, you will have to reference a map or find something to help you understand where the baseline and the principal meridian are. Now, once you've got your big square, the 36 square miles square, then that is broken up into 36 small squares, each representing a square mile. It's really interesting how they labeled this. You may think that it would be labeled as going straight across and then starting straight across, but it's a zigzag pattern. Again, you'll probably do better if you actually look at the blog post and look at the description. This is also on the FamilySearch Research Wiki, a visual for how this land works. But basically, you're running across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6, and then you drop down and coming back the other way, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then going back. So just picture a zigzag, and that's how it's numbered. Kind of tricky, but once you see it, then you get it. That was a set of 36 squares. Then you go to each individual square, and those are more likely the plots of lands that our ancestor owned. And each one of those smaller squares can also be divided. And so if you have one of those smaller squares divided, then you get a land description like a quarter, because they're taking that little square and dividing that into fourths, and your ancestor got a quarter of it or a half of it. That's kind of in a nutshell why you get all these different descriptions. And like I say, you need to go look at the actual map, and then that will help you to understand how it all works. But it's really fun once you get the hang of it to take one of those and map it all out. I know I did this when I was working on a project.
I've done all my land in state land states, but when I took the intermediate foundations course at SLAG virtually, which I recommend, it was great. We had a lesson on federal land states, and we had to locate some land from the description. And it was like the northeast quarter of section 14, Township 11, whatever it was, in a certain county. And then we had to go find that and trace it all through several different records. And I really liked it. It was great. I wish I did more research in federal land states.
Yeah, I think it's fun because you feel like it's a little bit easier than the state land states with the meets and bounds. I have done some of the surveying or, mapping the state land states, but that's one that if you get out of practice with it, you have to relearn it basically to do it again. So I like the federal land states too to map it. Let me just kind of explain how I use this for an actual research project. So those of you listening know that I'm always trying to find the father of my third great-grandmother, Cynthia Dillard. And she and her husband, Thomas B. Royston, had a lot of land that they lived on in Chambers County. They had all this land that they reported in the 1850 census. And I did a survey of all the deeds. And there were no deeds that showed how we got the land. And I realized that even though they kept keeping track of the records in 1834, his deeds either didn't get recorded or they were lost or destroyed or whatever. So I didn't know how we got the land. And I really had this hypothesis that Cynthia inherited the land from her father, George W. Dillard, who I think is her father, because he was living next door in Russell County, Alabama. But, I was hoping I'd find a deed where he gave it to his daughter, Cynthia Royston, or something like that. And I didn't find that. So what else could I do with the land? Well, I decided to try to figure out by mapping all the land of Thomas Royston if I could figure out where the land came from. So I did find him selling land. And because he was selling land, I was able to map out his 2 plantations. He actually had 2 plantations in the county. And then because we have land patents, which actually show the parameters of the land, I was able to figure out who he got the land from without a deed because I found the original patentees of the land. And no, there was no connection to George W. Dillard. But it was really fun because I now have this map of his land. It was really cool. Even though I didn't prove what I wanted to, I learned a lot about mapping the land.
So a time that I used a lot of deeds was my John Johnson project in North Carolina. And there were more than 2 John Johnsons living in Rowan County. So what I did is I made a table with each of the land transactions that I could find for John Johnson in that county and the range of years that I was looking at. And I started just by putting in the grantor and the grantee and the witnesses and the land description, and then like a link to the original record. This took a long time, but as I went, I started to notice connections between certain transactions, mostly that they had the same witnesses or the same grantors or grantees. So I began to kind of group them. And the land descriptions were helpful too, because they often would say that the land was nearby a certain person. And so all these different associates kind of helped me separate the men into different groups. And it became really clear that there was one John Johnson who had moved away to Davidson County because in a lot of the deeds, it said John Johnson of Davidson County, Tennessee. So right away, I could take all of those land records that were kind of similar to that one and separate them as being different from the subject I was researching, because the John Johnson that I was researching died in Rowan County and didn't move to Davidson. So having all this huge list with all of the data of witnesses and land descriptions was really how I separated the John Johnsons into different men and figured out who was who. And I could also put them into an exact place because I found a map showing all the creeks in the county, and those creeks were where the land was described to be near. So each land description would mention what creek it was on. That was really integral to the study, was knowing where all the creeks were. And you know what I discovered is that there were 2 Beaver Dam creeks. And that really threw me for a loop because there were 2 different John Johnsons living on 2 different Beaver Dam creeks. And you know what? Actually, one was Beaver Dam Creek and one was Beaver Creek. So once I figured that out, then it really came together.
Wow. Yeah, that's a great example. And if you can figure that out with John Johnson and 6 different John Johnsons, then that makes everything else a piece of cake, right?
Well, there was so much information within each land record that it just really showed me how useful those land records are. Because you might think, well, it doesn't have a lot of genealogical information in it. But until you get a project where you're trying to really just identify a person in order to make the next genealogical connection to their parents, then you really need this kind of record. It's part of your reasonably exhaustive research to look at all these things.
Well, and it reminds me of a talk I just listened to by Elizabeth Schoen Mills. It was from NGS 2018, and she talks about mining the records for every little clue. And if we have not delved into land records, then we are certainly not doing that because they do have so many clues. Who are they buying the land from? Who are they selling the land to? Often in a land record, the wife is mentioned. So if the man was selling land, he had to have his wife sign off on her dower rights, which was her third of the land after he had died. And so it can be the only place you actually get the name of the wife if it's really early and she's not ever listed in the census. It doesn't often give her maiden name, but you at least get a first name. And that can be very, very helpful. I was able to put together a whole family based on land records because the deed mentioned part of the estate that the man was leaving to his daughter and the son-in-law, and it was the only record. There was no probate, there was no census, no tax record. It was only in the land record that mentioned the relationships. So we, to do reasonably exhaustive research and to break down our brick walls, because that's the whole purpose of, learning to research like a pro. It's to break down brick walls. We owe it to ourselves to learn about the land.
Well, good luck, everybody. Go find out if your relative that you're researching right now is in a state land state or a federal land state. And then maybe look and see if you can find some land records for them. Next week, we will talk about land records again with United States Land Records Part 2. So we will talk to you again soon. Have a great week.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Research Like a Pro with Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional, and Nicole Dyer. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your own genealogy research. If you like what you heard, please leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher, or visit our website, familylocket.com, to contact us. You can find our book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist Guide, on Amazon.com and other booksellers. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.